Thank you. After all the heavy science of the last session, please treat this as a bit of comic relief. But I'm just going to talk to you about how microbes and human evolution have coexisted, and how every one of us here is here because of the immune system of one of our ancestors that prevented us from dying from all the diseases that were killing us all the time over the millennia. And so what type of microbes, because I think they are the most important determinant of human evolutions, influenced human DNA. As we know, they've been a major factor in determining the genetic makeup of the entire mammalian population, not just human, mammalian. And this is a pure form of Darwinism, selection and sex. Now that I've had your attention, the sex comes later. But microbes and humans have interacted over the millennia. It's called mutualism. Nope. So what is mutualism? The microbe comes along, kills a host. Some hosts are resistant. So then the resistant host is not infected, but some of the microbes are not affected by the host resistance. And so a new form of the same microbe becomes the dominant species, starts killing people. This goes on in cycles over millennia. So what makes an ideal or a non-ideal parasite and the host, and how do they learn to coexist? An ideal microbe is one that takes a long time to kill the host, if it does, but makes him just feel a bit miserable, or her, and so it can coexist. And therefore, by not killing or maiming the host, it allows the host to procreate, have children, and allows the microbe to continue to infect the host, because a parasite needs a host. If it kills the host quickly, then it has no way of progressing. So one of the ones I like is brucella. It's called undulating fever. It makes you sick for 2 or 3 days, then you get better and you forget you've got it. So it lives with you very easily, and therefore it can continue on infecting people. There is a form of brucella called Brucella abortus, and it attacks animals in herds of the Negev Bedouin, for instance. It causes the abortion of a kid. That's the first kid. After that, they have normal kids. So there's very little chance we'll ever get rid of this brucella, because the Bedouin don't want to get rid of it. Their herds can live quite easily with that. So, but others are, for instance, malaria. Now there are several types of malaria. Falciparum is deadly, it kills people. But Vivax doesn't. It makes you ill for a few days, you get temperature, you go to bed, you get a little bit green, then you get better. So that form of malaria can persist, but if it kills everybody, it won't. Another one is the sleeping sickness. There are 2 types. There's the savanna type, which is deadly, and there's a mountain type. The mountain type doesn't kill you. You just get a little bit more tired than usual every now and then, and you feel a bit sick. My opinion, bacteria want to stay alive. They want to become ideal types of pathogens. And I think the gradation between Vivax and Falciparum and mountain sleeping sickness and savanna sleeping sickness shows how this works. Now, just a minute. So what type of microbes could influence human genetics? The non-ideal microbes kill the host quickly, does not allow resistance to develop, comes in as epidemics. Not ideal, And that's why epidemics come and epidemics go, because it kills off the people, loses its host reservoir. But sometimes these epidemics do target very specific population. The 1918 flu epidemic targeted young people. And after the Second World War, by targeting younger people, it also targeted future generations. And it could have changed the DNA, the genetics of the remaining people. It didn't, because it wasn't big enough, but it did cause a lot of deaths among soldiers. And it probably did influence, say, the officer class, which had already been decimated by the First World War in both the English and the German armies. Smallpox in the Americas, huge death rate. What is not known is that when Cortes came over and tried to conquer the Incas, the first year they drove him back. He didn't win the first year. He came back a year later, and more than half the Inca army was dead from smallpox. At least that's what they say was there. It could be something else. Did that influence the genetic makeup of the remaining population? And the question we should be asking is not how many died, but why did the survivors not die? The same thing can be said of the measles epidemic in the European contact with the Pacific Islands. In some of these islands, 50% of the population perished from a measles epidemic. So once more you ask, 50% died, 50% survived. Did that influence the genetics of the remaining population? Yes, it must have, because once more you should ask the question, why only 50%? Was there something in that 50%, in their genetics or their immune system, that made them more immune to dying from measles, from smallpox? So Yersinia, the Black Death, of course, 30 to 40% of the European population died. And once more you say, okay, what happened to the survivors? Why did they survive? Now the big one, as far as I'm concerned, in determining why we're all here, is tuberculosis. It's one of the oldest diseases, as some of the work with Israel's Atlit Yam shows. It was present in a population 8,000 years ago. And it's been determining, certainly since urbanization, the remnant population. So just going to show you a couple. You've seen this before, 2 lectures ago. This is a crypt that was discovered in Hungary. There were 263 coffins. 2/3 of these were mummified. And there we are. The interesting thing about this is that if you look at the bottom line, 62% of all the samples we took, and we sampled every one of these bodies, 62% were found to have be positive for TB DNA, not necessarily for the disease killing them, but they had some form of the disease present in their bodies. And I was told, or asked, that's a huge number, that's a huge percentage. I think it only means that in 38% we still haven't found it. Because I think at this period of time, 300 years ago, everybody in Europe had some form of TB. Most of them got it as young kids. It's called the Goan focus. They fell sick for a while, then got better. The thing sort of became calcified. Nothing wrong with them. They lived forever. And the best one of these is our 95-year-old Hungarian mummy. I sampled right, left chest, right, left abdomen, negative. But then we took an X-ray and we found, what you can see from the arrow, a small calcified node. I went back, endoscoped her, sampled that, very positive for TB. Loads of it, very easy, no problem. It means this 95-year-old lady, and probably as a 5-year-old child, or even less, had TB. She cured herself. And once more, the question is why? So then we went to, and you've already heard about this family group. There is a mother, whose picture you saw, who died in December 1793. There's her older daughter, who died in 97, and her younger daughter, who died in 95. They all have TB, and Mark explained to you exactly what type at least two of them had. But the question that you have to ask is, there was a husband and there was a son. Now, the town of Vatch is very well preserved, and I've sat in their lounge room of this family, and I've been to the bedroom. And it's very confined, and for 6 months of the year they would certainly have lived very much indoors. The father and son had no evidence of TB. We couldn't even find a lymph node. But they lived together, and this is a disease where if you cough, you can pick up your TB. And the question you have to ask is, why didn't the father and the son get TB? They were in closest contact to this people. And not only that, the mother died in 93, the two daughters, 95 and 97, who looked after them? The father and the son. Because there's no evidence in the church records that they were removed. Yet they didn't catch TB. And that's prompted us to ask the question, what was it in the genetic makeup of these two other people that caused them not to get TB? And how did it differ from these three? And initially, 20 years ago, I looked and asked my first postdoc on this project, Ian Barnes, to look up the NRAMP gene, as it was called then. And he found 5 papers and they were of no help. 5 years later, Carney Matheson found about 50 papers. And then Giller had this brilliant idea that the Cur gene, which she was working on with Mary Carrington, and it's the gene that allows the HIV virus to enter a cell, but she thought, well, if it allows the virus, why not the bacteria? Because TB is an intracellular disease. So we have started looking at the changes in the genetic makeup of some of our Hungarian people to see if there is a variance between those who got TB and died of it, those who got TB and seemed to survive, and it didn't bother them. And this we published, I think, in March in a journal called Tuberculosis, a very preliminary and not really great data, but it's preliminary and there are a few suggestions that it may be helpful. Now, I'm not sure whether it was this, but I believe it was Mark's paper in Nature Communications that made people start thinking about, could there be some sort of clue? And don't be embarrassed. Because we got this very interesting blog, thanks to Mark over here, from a guy called Bill Gates. Now, I'm going to offer you all a bribe. There will be a certain amount of negotiations, but if anybody can introduce either Mark or this Mark or that Mark to Bill Gates, we may be able to talk some financial recompense, because if we can get to him, I don't know, maybe there is some money for continuing this research. So, I'm just going to talk to you about how mutualism works with a couple of explanations. Pathogens, humans, adjusting. That is, we're adjusting the DNA of both populations. So we'll go to leprosy, and we once more recently published a paper which took many years about a group of Turkoman warriors who crossed from Turkey into Europe and formed what is known as the Avar Empire. What we do know about them is that in about 800 AD they tried to take over Constantinople, or Istanbul as it's now known, failed, were bought off by the Holy Roman Emperor, and they went into Europe. They then formed a sort of kingdom in the area marked here. Now, we got interested in them because went to Ankara, and there is that site Kuvahanya here, and from there we found they showed us an Avar burial with leprosy. And then in Hungary we knew there were Avar burials as well. So I ended up having a very nice tour. It took a few years, and I went to Budapest, I went to Vienna, I went to Bologna, all for work, of course, you know, no hanky-panky or anything, and even to Tivoli. And we got samples of Avar burials from each of these, and we've checked them out, and they all had leprosy, and the Avars formed this kingdom from where they raided all over Europe. And just an example of a typical leprosy case, you notice the nose is gone, and this is one of the Avar burials. I think it's from Bologna, and there's another. And what happened to the Avars? Charlemagne defeated them in the Alps, and the kingdom just disappeared. And that's a nice picture. I don't know why I put it, but that's the Avars fighting Charlemagne. But they're easy to spot. We know who the Avars were. They bury their warriors with their horses, and they have very distinctive gear. So why am I talking about this? Because it was about this time of the Avars that Europe started having a major problem with leprosy. And within 100 years of the Avars appearing, nearly every town in Europe had a monastery which was a leprosaria. And there were literally hundreds of cases. So we also know, because we've already done somebody from the Second Temple period in Jerusalem, that person, and it was mentioned again, had leprosy. So there was leprosy before these guys arrived, but not in epidemic proportions. So the Avars brought what we believe is a strain of leprosy which was new, more infectious, and suddenly the number of cases rose dramatically. But then towards the middle medieval period, and I'm very grateful to Hillel Bukovia over here who pointed this out to me, the leprosy cases started going down long before there was any known treatment. The incidence dropped, and in fact around 1400, these leprosoria were in monasteries, and the local duke or count or whatever used to give them money to look after these people. They started dropping in numbers, and some of these monasteries found they had 1 or 2 lepers who were aging. So actually this is the first major stock exchange bubble that occurred. There was a trade for lepers, and your monastery would have 1 or 2 and looked like losing funding, so you'd go to a monastery down the road that had a few and say, how much will you give me for a couple of your lepers? And this went on for quite a while. But leprosy kept dropping. Now, why did it drop? Did we wipe out the people who were susceptible? Did TB come along? Or did the bacteria also try to become more ideal? In other words, it may affect you but not give you the same. So it changed form, so it wasn't the one that caused you to lose your fingers and toes and nose, but one that just made you a little sick and maybe have a few bits of illness. So there is syphilis here. Now, as you know, there are 2 theories about treponema. There's the Columbian theory that syphilis was brought to Europe by Columbus. There's the pre-Columbian theory that it existed before. And there is some bony evidence among the skeletal material in Europe that some form mimicking syphilis was present and was giving similar problems. Whether it was Begel or whether it was actually the venereal syphilis, we don't know. But certainly Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And he came back to Europe in 1493. Then Charles the Eighth was besieging Naples with Spanish mercenaries, and it became an epidemic. And by the way, as usual, there was a group blamed for its transfer all over Europe. I'll give you 2 guesses how history hasn't changed. It was the Jews who were blamed because they'd just been expelled from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella, and they all migrated all over Europe, and it was said, and it could be right this time, you know, they were spreading syphilis. Pardon? 1994, well, you know, this was written in the rainforest of Costa Rica, where I was on holiday until a week ago. So it's all right. I was a few hundred years out, but what's 400 years between friends? Good Lord, everywhere. Well, there you are. 1594. 1494, God. Anyway, Columbus arrives. Within 18 months, there is an edict from the Diet of Worms, which suggests the presence of a widespread epidemic killing people within months or 1 to 2 years. You know, we know syphilis is a disease that you get infected, you get the first stage, you have a little sore, then for 10, 20 years, nothing happens. And then 20 years later, suddenly the 2nd, 3rd and 4th stages come. Now, the problem with ancient DNA and syphilis is that this is such a weak bug that the moment the patient coughs, the bacteria probably dies. And certainly it is not as preserved as the TB, as you heard, which has got a nice thick coating, and TB is a soil bacterium at its roots. So it can exist in an anaerobic environment. Syphilis dies if your temperature falls a couple of degrees. So when the patient dies, the bug lyses and probably the DNA isn't preserved. The other problem is that by the time you get the typical bony changes of syphilis, there are no bacteria left. It's an immune response. So when people bring bones with syphilis, saying this is typical syphilis, can you find the DNA? We've had to say no. And this is borne out because, you know, the Americans have been trying to prove syphilis has DNA for years, and the only paper I've ever seen about it was written about 15 years ago by Noreen Shuris, and she found some DNA of syphilis 80 years ago. I know we had a Hungarian mummy which has syphilis, and I know Marina looked at it and she thought she may have a band which could be like syphilis, but could never repeat it. And if Marina can't repeat it, it's irrepeatable. So, but we found TB in this guy, which is co-infection, but the syphilis, no way. And I don't think you will ever, I'll be proven wrong one day, ever find the DNA of syphilis from ancient specimens. And this disease, which was killing people in 1 or 2 years, had within probably 50 years become this protected long-term disease. So this is once more, in my opinion, the bacteria adapting to the fact that if it was killing people 1 or 2 years, it wasn't being spread. But any form of syphilis that took longer, that could be spread. I'm not willing to say that within 50 years we'd killed off every susceptible person in Europe because they'd all had sex with somebody they shouldn't have and died. So that's a couple of examples of how there is an interreaction. Not only that the human genome changes, which it does with bacteria, but the bacteria also changes to try to become more ideal, because that's the only way it can survive within the population. So finally, what next? And what I'm going to say is pure theory, but I'm going to use sickle cell anemia as an example. Genes that carry disease have got to have a benefit in order to survive in our population. If they don't have a benefit, they should be bred out. So sickle cell anemia, I'm not sure if you know about it, is a disease in the jungles of Africa that stops people getting malaria. And that's great in Africa. In fact, the best warriors in Africa were the ones with sickle cell because they weren't being debilitated by malaria. And the best women, whom the best warriors always married, were the ones who had the trait, and they also didn't have malaria. And so they kept their nice figures and didn't look hectic. Along came the slavers, and who did they want to pick to capture, to take to the cane fields and the cotton fields of America and the Caribbean? They preferred the nice, tough warriors and their women. And on the slave ships, where the mortality was about 50%, who survived? The ones who were the toughest on board. So landing in America is a disproportionate number of carriers of sickle cell and sickle cell sufferers. They get to America, and of course there's no malaria, except maybe in Washington. No, it's true. The Sandy Bottom was a malaria place in Washington. And all of a sudden, you hear Mark Twain talking about the lazy black guy who wants to sit in the sun and doesn't want to work and wants to sleep all day. He wasn't lazy. He was anemic. And having anemia in America, having sickle cell, was a detriment. It wasn't a benefit. So I use this as an introduction to cancer genes, which some of you might know is my latest crazy idea. It'll also be proven wrong, but I'll have fun making sure it is. A couple of months ago, in this university, we had a very nice lady from the American Cancer Society present her latest business on the cancer genes. BRCA1, BRCA2, and there is a form of BRCA1 which is specific to Jewish women, and it gives them either ovarian or breast cancer. And just as an aside, she was advocating that these women, as soon as they finished having children, should have bilateral mastectomies, bilateral oophorectomies, in order to stop them getting these cancers. And it was at this stage I regretted that I'd retired from surgery, because my God, there's millions to be made out of this. Thousands of women, and each one needs mastectomy, oophorectomy, breast reconstruction. Oh, it's amazing. But anyway, she also said something very interesting. She said that this one form of BRCA gene has now been traced back, and don't ask me how, but she's a very serious lady, and I believed every word she said, so did Chuck. Started in Lithuania, can be traced back to starting in Lithuania in the 16th century. And that's also interesting, because Lithuania in the 16th century was urbanizing. And you think, why did we get this wretched gene which is going to kill us? And maybe there was some genetic selection, because maybe with urbanization there's an increase in tuberculosis. And I think today on Google I received proofs, and it's on Google, of a paper we've written about X-ray examination of some Lithuanian mummies full of TB. So maybe this BRCA gene change didn't occur in order to give these women breast cancer. Maybe there was some other reason why it came, and it became an increasing number of survivors had genes. Maybe this genetic change also gave you some sort of protection against TB. Now, it's a way out theory, but if we can get into the cemeteries of Lithuania from this period and see who was dying of TB and whether they all had or didn't have this genetic change, maybe we will find that there is some sort of statement we can make that some of these changes, and I'm talking specifically now of cancer genes and other genes, when they first came to our population, helped us. Now, like the sickle cell gene, they're a detriment. And with that, I'd like to thank you all and for not walking out, and thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, with the risk of asking a dumb question.
It's all right. It was a dumb presentation. That's all right.
So you focus on why people die because of bacteria. And there is the other pole, which is why people live longer because of bacteria.
That's right.
So why don't people look at the other side as well and find centennials, people who live long, and see what bacteria help them to live long?
Well, I've got enough on my plate and people dying. There are so many young people here. I think you should work out why you live longer. So the answer is, it's not an unreasonable thing to think about.
There's in fact several studies, one in Italy I know of, where they specifically look on centenarians and they actually study the microbiome and see if they find correlations. Sardinia, there's also a big study where they do exactly that. But but so far no big kind of bacteria which are kind of responsible for the long age effect. I think even centarians in Sardinia have some bacteria which were thought to actually be negative. Just preliminary results.
I was corrected by Hillel when I said leprosy disappeared with the Industrial Revolution. I tried to argue back, well, I didn't mean the Industrial Revolution, I meant the increase in tuberculosis. But in Ben's talk, he actually showed the drop in grades from TB. I'd love you guys to get together and really see if we can say something about TB and leprosy together in terms of number of grades, number of leprosaria, etc. It would be an interesting connection, and we could make it interesting.
Can I make one point? In TB, we all say that the antibiotics helped TB eradication, but in fact, if you look at it rationally, TB sanatoria were closing well before the onset of antibiotics. There was a decrease in the incidence of TB. I think it's because it was trying to become a more ideal bug. But at the same time, when I was doing this research, I looked up some papers from Russia from the 1700s where they said the Jews must be responsible for TB because army units containing a lot of Jews have far less TB. Then you go to England in 1870, I must get my centuries right, and the British Medical Journal makes the comment that tuberculosis appears to have decreased in the East End since the migration of Jews into this area from Russia. And so you've got to ask yourself, why are the Jews said to be resistant to TB? Maybe there is something there that makes them resistant. Who knows? But there are these comments. It could be cleanliness, it could be all sorts of things. But we have to understand that there is human genetic change which does affect what and how badly things infect us.
Mark, do you have any evidence or what can pinpoint of the virulence of that strain of leprosy and leprosy?
Oh, it's all these clever people here will do that. I just talk about it. They actually do it.
They have done it already?
I'm not sure. Put your hand up if you have. Well, get on with it. Sir, there was one more. Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that people can get infected with adapted, less lethal strain or form? You cannot get infected at the same time with a more lethal form because it has to be true what you suggest.
Well, if you get infected by the Salk vaccine of polio, you're supposed to be protected against polio. So there is evidence here. This is live virus, right? But as we've seen from Mark's talk, people don't get infected with necessarily with one strain, multiple strains. So, yeah, if you get TB, you have got some sort of immunity, but it isn't global. You may get a different immunity, or, as we've recently seen in Russia with the fall of communism, TB had almost been eradicated in Russia. Fall of communism, increased vodka drinking, increased prison population. The prison population in Russia now is riddled with TB. Did it come out of the blue? Or did these people have, like my 95-year-old lady, a little gone focus, calcified lymph node, which actually had TB inside, alive? Suddenly their immune system is attacked because they don't have the right diet, they drink too much, this breaks out and becomes an infection. So these people may have been infected, they got some sort of immunity, but not total.
Thank you very much.